A 65-year-old veteran was driving home from a cabinet repair when his German Shepherd froze beside a lonely Michigan lake road. In the tall grass, a policewoman lay silent, her broken radio beside her. The dog placed one tiny blue clue into the old man's hand. Her first whisper was not a name, but a warning from New Orleans. If you believe God still sends faithful animals to guide the forgotten home, leave amen. North Hallow, Michigan, looked like the kind of town that had been painted by a patient hand. White porches leaned toward clean sidewalks, pine trees stood tall behind little wooden homes, and Lake Superior shone beyond the roofs like a wide silver shield. In early summer, the air carried the smell of lake water, cut grass, and old wood warming under the sun. Warren Pike knew those smells the way some men knew hymns. At 65, he moved slower than he used to, but his hands still understood hinges, warped drawers, uneven cabinet doors, and the quiet complaints of old houses. Warren was tall and lean, with a slight bend in his shoulders, a trimmed gray beard, and pale blue eyes that seemed calm until a memory passed behind them. He had been a soldier once. Now he fixed kitchens for widows, doors for retired teachers, and porch steps for men too proud to admit their knees had become unreliable. That afternoon, Warren had just finished repairing the kitchen cabinets in Mrs. Adler's house at the far end of Old Juniper Road. Mrs. Ruth Adler was 72, a small widow with soft white curls, bright cheeks, and the determined kindness of a woman who could make a guest feel guilty for refusing pie. Her kitchen smelled of peach cobbler, damp pine boards, and the blueberry jam cooling by the window. The bottom drawer had been stuck for months. The left cabinet hinge sagged like a tired eyelid, and one old oak door had swollen from lake moisture until it groaned every time it opened. Warren sanded, adjusted, tightened, and listened, while Mrs. Adler told him about the squirrels in her bird feeder as if they were organized criminals. Under the kitchen table lay Ranger, Warren's 7-year-old German Shepherd. Ranger had a sable coat, dark along the back and golden brown at the chest, with upright ears, a broad head, and thoughtful brown eyes that made strangers feel politely examined. His muzzle had begun to silver, but his body was still strong, his movements careful and deliberate. Ranger had once been trained for civilian search work and later became Warren's steady companion after the years grew too quiet. He was not loud. He did not waste motion. But when Ranger noticed something, Warren had learned to pay attention. Mrs. Adler set a slice of peach cobbler on a plate and pushed it toward Warren. "A man who lives alone and refuses dessert is a danger to civilization," she said. Warren looked down at Ranger, who stared at the cobbler with the solemn focus of a judge hearing final testimony. "He agrees with you," Warren said. "He has sense," Mrs. Adler replied. "You could borrow some." By the time Warren loaded his toolbox into his old blue pickup, Mrs. Adler had pressed a jar of blueberry jam into his hands. He tried to refuse. She narrowed her eyes. He accepted. That was how most arguments with Mrs. Adler ended. The main road back into town was busy with summer visitors, and a repair crew had one lane blocked near the marina. So Warren took Old Juniper Road, the narrow lake road he always used after jobs on this side of North Hallow. He also meant to stop at Miller's Corner Store for Ranger's food. It was all ordinary. A cabinet job, a jar of jam, a dog in the passenger seat, and the late sun laying gold across the pines. Warren liked ordinary things. After his wife Elaine passed, ordinary things had kept him from falling too far inward. Coffee at dawn, wood shavings on the shop floor, Ranger's paws clicking across the kitchen, the occasional call from Molly, his daughter in Minnesota, who loved him, but no longer knew how to reach him without sounding careful. Warren understood that distance. He had built some of it himself, plank by plank, silence by silence. Some men repaired doors because they did not know how to repair conversations. A sudden scrape broke the calm. Ranger's claws against the dashboard, sharp and urgent, followed by one low sound from deep in his chest. The road, the pines, even the lake light seemed to pause. Warren eased off the gas. "What is it, boy?" Ranger was not looking at the trees. His ears stood high, his nose angled toward the grass along the right shoulder. He gave another low whine, then pressed one paw against the windshield as if trying to point beyond it. Warren pulled over beside the ditch, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Before the truck had fully settled, Ranger was at the door, waiting. Warren opened it, and the dog leapt down, moving fast but controlled, straight toward a patch of tall grass near the curve. At first, Warren saw only weeds shifting in the breeze. Then he saw a dark sleeve, a boot, a silver badge half hidden by grass. His breath caught. A woman lay on her side near the ditch, her police uniform dusty, her radio cracked beside her. One hand closed around a torn strip of gray fabric. She was in her mid-30s, with brown hair pulled low at the back of her head. A strong face made pale by shock, and a small line of dried mud along one cheek. Her nameplate read, "Donnelly." Warren knelt beside her without touching her too quickly. Ranger lowered himself near her shoulder, nose close, body still as a stone guardian. "She's breathing," Warren whispered. The old soldier inside him woke without permission. His hands steadied. He called emergency services, gave the road name, the curve marker, the condition he could see. He took off his jacket and laid it over her carefully. He did not move her more than necessary. He checked the broken radio, the torn fabric, the faint marks in the grass where tires had swerved near the shoulder. Near Ranger's front paw, a tiny piece of blue plastic caught the light. Ranger sniffed it, then looked up at Warren with those deep brown eyes, not afraid, not confused, only certain. The woman stirred. Warren leaned closer. "Officer Donnelly, help is coming. Stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered. For one brief second, her gray-blue eyes opened. She gripped his wrist with surprising strength, as if she were holding on from the edge of a dark river. "Not an accident," she breathed. "Esplanade, B-file. They brought the pattern north." Then her fingers loosened. Warren did not understand the words. Esplanade sounded like a place from some faraway city. B-file meant nothing to him. But Ranger rose, picked up the little blue plastic piece gently between his teeth, and placed it in Warren's open palm. Sirens came a few minutes later, thin at first, then louder as red light flashed through the pines. Paramedics took over. A deputy asked questions. Warren answered what he could. Ranger remained beside him, watching the stretcher roll toward the ambulance. As Officer Claire Donnelly was lifted inside, her hand shifted under the blanket, still holding the torn gray cloth. When the ambulance pulled away, Old Juniper Road became quiet again, too quiet. Warren stood beside his old pickup with Ranger at his feet, the jar of blueberry jam still on the passenger floor, his toolbox in the back, and the small blue piece of plastic folded inside his handkerchief. He had thought he was only driving home from a cabinet job, but Ranger had led him to a woman in the grass, a broken radio, and the first hidden hinge of a case much larger than North Hallow. Claire Donnelly woke to white ceiling tiles, the faint beep of a heart monitor, and the dry taste of fear on her tongue. The hospital room in North Hallow was small but clean, with pale blue curtains, a narrow window facing a row of birch trees, and a little vase of yellow flowers someone from the station had placed beside the bed. Morning light moved gently across the floor. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, Claire's fingers tightened around the blanket as if the road were still beneath her, cold grass brushing her cheek, broken voices moving above her like shadows. The doctor told her she had been found in time. Dr. Helen Sutter was a calm woman in her early 50s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with silver-threaded black hair pinned at the back of her head and kind brown eyes that missed very little. She spoke softly, the way people do when they have seen enough pain to stop raising their voice at it. Claire was weak, bruised by the fall and shock, but alive. "Whoever found you did everything right," Dr. Sutter said. "He kept you still, kept you warm, and called fast." Claire closed her eyes. She remembered a rough hand around her wrist, an old man's voice telling her help was coming, and beside that voice, the warm breath of a dog. Warren Pike sat outside the room with Ranger at his feet, though the nurse had told him 3 times that dogs were not usually permitted this far in. Ranger had simply lowered himself beside Warren's boots and looked at the nurse with such grave politeness that she sighed and said, "5 minutes." Warren still wore the same work shirt from the day before, sleeves rolled to the elbows, sawdust caught in one seam, his gray beard trimmed but not neat enough to suggest he had slept well. He had not. Ranger, the 7-year-old sable German shepherd with silver at the muzzle and a soldier's patience in his eyes, rested his chin on his paws, but did not sleep either. Every few seconds, his ears moved toward Claire's door. Sheriff Martin Vale arrived just after 8. He was 59, broad through the chest, with a weathered face, iron gray hair cut short, and a square jaw softened only by tired eyes. He had served North Hallow for 30 years, and people trusted him because he never hurried a truth just to make himself comfortable. He shook Warren's hand, then crouched briefly to let Ranger smell his knuckles. "This the dog?" Martin asked. "This is Ranger," Warren said. "I just drive where he tells me." Martin almost smiled. "Wish some deputies had that much sense." The sheriff took Warren's statement in a quiet corner near the vending machines. Warren explained everything plainly. He had been at Mrs. Ruth Adler's house repairing kitchen cabinets. He had a written appointment in his truck, a receipt book, and a toolbox full of the day's work. He had taken Old Juniper Road because the main road by the marina was crowded with summer traffic and partly blocked for repairs. He had planned to stop at Miller's Corner store for Ranger's food. Then Ranger alerted. Warren pulled over, and they found Officer Donnelly in the grass. It was simple. Too simple, maybe. The kind of simple that made a man uneasy because it placed him exactly where he needed to be, without asking his permission. Claire asked to speak before noon. Her voice was hoarse, but her mind was working behind her gray-blue eyes. Warren stood near the end of the bed, hat in both hands. Ranger sat beside him, still as a carved guardian. Claire looked at the dog first. "You found me." Ranger blinked once. "He accepts praise quietly," Warren said, "unless it comes with bacon." Claire's mouth almost became a smile, but memory pulled it away. "I was following a white van," she said. "Not officially enough to make my captain happy. Officially enough to make someone nervous." She paused, gathering breath. The van was linked to a donation group, cabinets, old furniture, household goods. They moved things from state to state under the cover of charity. Sheriff Martin leaned closer. "Harbor Hands Relief?" Claire nodded. "I think someone is using them, or someone inside them is using the name." The metal tray beside Claire's bed gave a sudden soft rattle, though no one touched it. Ranger's head snapped toward the chair where her uniform jacket hung, and the room fell still enough for everyone to hear the monitor's next small beep. Ranger rose slowly and stepped toward the jacket. He did not bark. He sniffed the sleeve, then the lower hem, and drew back with a low breath through his nose. Warren knew that look. Ranger had worn it once after finding a lost hunter near a frozen creek, and once after refusing to enter a shed where spilled chemicals had made the air wrong. Warren leaned closer to the jacket and caught it too. Faint, but familiar. Sharp cleaner, motor oil, damp dust, and pressed wood. Not ordinary road dirt, not hospital disinfectant. Something from a storage place. Something from cheap cabinet backing and sealed crates. "I've smelled that," Warren said. Claire looked at him. "On old kitchen units, Donation stock. The kind folks unload from warehouses and call good enough for people who can't complain. Claire swallowed. That fits. Then she said the name that had followed her out of the dark. Bashaman. Martin's eyes narrowed. Warren waited. Blake Anthony Bashaman, Claire said carefully. 28. Orleans Parish, New Orleans. Federal case, public record. He was tied to possession with intent to distribute banned substances. NOPD picked him up near the 500 block of Esplanade Avenue while he had an active felony warrant. The material was separated into small packets, consistent with street-level distribution near the French Quarter. She looked at Warren, making sure he understood the boundary. I am not saying he runs anything here. I am saying the pattern traveled. Someone in North Hallow is copying the method, or picking up pieces after that case drew attention. Warren did not like the way the room seemed to shrink around that explanation. New Orleans felt far from their bright lake town, far from Mrs. Adler's peach cobbler and Nora Bell's coffee. But evil, he had learned long ago, did not mind travel. It packed light. After the hospital, Warren stopped at Maple Bell Diner because Nora Bell saw his truck through the window and pointed at the curb like a traffic officer. Nora was 61, round-faced, red hair fading to silver at the roots, with strong arms from carrying coffee pots and a tongue sharp enough to cut toast. She owned the diner, remembered everyone's usual order, and treated sadness as something best served with eggs. "You sit," she told Warren. "You saved a policewoman. Breakfast is on the house." "Ranger saved her," Warren said. Nora placed a small piece of cooked meat on a napkin in front of the dog. "Then he gets paid first." Ranger ate it with solemn dignity, as if accepting a medal from Congress. Later, back at his truck, Warren reached into the rear bed for his socket set. Ranger stood suddenly and scratched at the wooden toolbox. Warren frowned, lifted the tray of wrenches, and saw a tiny blue fleck caught in the corner seam. He picked it up with 2 fingers. Plastic, the same shade as the piece from Old Juniper Road. His mind moved backward. Mrs. Adler's garage, the donation cabinet that had not belonged to her, the dusty floor, his boot stepping near it before he left. That evening, in his workshop behind the house, Warren placed both blue pieces side by side beneath the yellow lamp. Ranger stood with his front paws on the bench, nose hovering above them, eyes dark and certain. A lake road, a wounded officer, an old cabinet, and a case from New Orleans had all found their way onto the same wooden table. And Warren Pike, who had spent years repairing doors that would not close right, had the uneasy feeling that one had just opened. The next morning, Warren Pike drove back to Mrs. Adler's house with a lie small enough to fit in his shirt pocket. He told himself he had forgotten his measuring tape. That was true, in the way a cracked window was still a window. The tape measure was sitting on his workbench at home, exactly where he had left it. But Warren needed a reason to return to the garage where that donated cabinet had stood. He drove slowly along Old Juniper Road, Ranger sitting upright beside him, sable coat catching the pale northern sun. The lake glittered between the pines, and every white house along the road seemed too peaceful to be connected to a broken radio, a wounded officer, and a blue fleck of plastic resting now in an evidence bag at the sheriff's office. Mrs. Ruth Adler opened the door before Warren could knock twice. The 72-year-old widow wore a lavender house dress, white slippers, and the suspicious expression of a woman who knew when a man had come back for more than a measuring tape. Her soft white curls were pinned unevenly, and flour dusted one cheek like she had been negotiating with a pie crust and losing with dignity. "You forgot something," she said. "My tape. You never forget tools." "I'm aging into mystery." She looked down at Ranger, who stood quietly beside Warren's leg. "And he looks like he knows the whole sermon before the preacher starts." Still, she stepped aside and let them in. The kitchen smelled of coffee, peaches, and old wood warmed by morning light. Warren made a show of glancing around the counter, then nodded toward the garage. That cabinet from yesterday still here? Mrs. Adler's face changed just slightly. No, they came early. Who did? Harbor Hands Relief, Caleb Rusk's people. She led him through the kitchen toward the garage door. They said it was only being stored here until they could take it to the community center. Came from down south, they told me. Hotel renovation, church donation, one of those stories with enough kindness in it to make you feel rude for asking questions. The garage was tidy in the way older widows kept things tidy. Every jar on a shelf, every snow shovel hung by the handle, every cardboard box labeled in dark marker. But on the concrete floor near the far wall was a clean rectangle of dust where the cabinet had stood. Ranger walked to it without being told. He lowered his head, sniffed once, then twice, and stood still. Mrs. Adler folded her arms. June told me not to sign the receipt until I read the bottom line. June? June Merritt. Volunteers with Harbor Hands. Little woman, silver hair, always carrying that sewing bag like she's ready to mend the whole town. She said, Ruth, never trust a form that smiles too much. I thought she was just being fussy. Warren looked at the empty rectangle on the floor. Maybe fussy is just careful wearing a church hat. Before Mrs. Adler could answer, a white van rolled into the driveway. Its side read, Harbor Hands Relief in clean blue letters beside a painted image of two open palms holding a little house. A man stepped out with a clipboard. He was in his early 40s, medium height, broad through the shoulders, with dark blonde hair combed neatly back and a short beard trimmed close to his jaw. His tan jacket was too clean for a moving job, and his smile arrived before the rest of him, smooth and practiced. This was Caleb Rusk, and at first glance he looked like the kind of man church ladies trusted with folding chairs, donation envelopes, and the last piece of pie. His voice was gentle, almost musical. Mrs. Adler, Mr. Pike. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Depends what a man is hauling, Warren said. Caleb's smile did not falter. Household donations, mostly. We try to keep useful things out of landfills and put them with folks who need them. Ranger moved between Caleb and the garage. Not fast, not threatening, simply present. His ears lifted. His head dipped toward a second cabinet still strapped inside the van, a narrow white unit with fresh paint and brass handles that shone too brightly for old furniture. Caleb noticed. Handsome dog. He is, Warren said. Also rude when something smells wrong. Caleb gave a soft laugh, but one hand tightened around his clipboard. Warren walked closer to the cabinet in the van, not touching it, just looking with a carpenter's eye. The paint was too new, thick around the lower seam. The hinges were modern, but the wood beneath them was older. At the base, a faint line had been brushed over in white, the kind of line a man hid when he wanted a second bottom to look like the first. Ranger's claw touched the cabinet once, and a dry flake of white paint fell onto the van floor. Beneath it, black marker showed through like a secret opening one eye. Warren saw only part of it before Caleb stepped forward. Route E500/FQ. Careful, Caleb said, still pleasant. Some of these pieces are fragile. So are people, Warren replied. For one breath, the driveway seemed to hold still. Mrs. Adler stood on the porch with one hand at her throat. Ranger did not move from his place near the van. Then Caleb slid the cabinet deeper inside and closed the door with a quiet click. We'll be on our way. Busy schedule. After he left, Warren wrote the marking on the back of an old grocery receipt. He did not explain everything to Mrs. Adler. There was no kindness in giving fear before there was proof. He only told her not to sign any more donation forms until Sheriff Vale looked them over. Mrs. Adler nodded. For once, she did not offer cobbler. By afternoon, Warren met Claire Donnelly in a small sitting room at the hospital. She was pale but sharper than the day before. Her dark brown hair tied back loosely, a thin blanket over her knees. Sheriff Martin Vale stood near the window, arms crossed. Warren showed them the receipt. Claire read the words, and the room's warmth seemed to thin. FQ could be French Quarter, she said. E500 could be a route marker tied to Esplanade, but not enough by itself. It is a thread, not a rope. Threads pull seams apart, Warren said. Claire looked at him. The first anonymous note I got said, "Look at the cabinets." The handwriting shook. Older person, maybe. I never knew who sent it. Warren thought of June Merritt and her sewing bag. Later, at Maple Bell Diner, he saw her. June sat alone in a corner booth, a tiny woman of 68 with curled silver hair, round glasses, pale skin, and a blue cardigan buttoned to the throat. A quilted sewing bag rested beside her hip. When she reached for her tea, the bag tipped, spilling 3 spools of thread across the floor. Ranger stepped forward and sniffed the bag longer than politeness required. June's laugh trembled. "Smart dogs make me nervous." Nora Bell, the red-haired diner owner with flour on her sleeve and a voice that could straighten a crooked fence, brought Warren coffee. "June forgets her sugar, her umbrella, and sometimes my name," Nora whispered. "But she never forgets who owes the church bake sale money." Warren watched June gather her thread. Something in her hands did not look forgetful. That evening, Molly called from Minnesota. Warren stood in his dim kitchen, the old wall phone pressed to his ear, Ranger lying near the stove. Molly Pike was 38, a school teacher with her mother's warm brown eyes and Warren's stubborn chin. Her voice carried worry wrapped in restraint. "Dad, I heard you found that officer." Ranger found her. "I provided transportation and poor conversation." "This is not funny." "No, but funny keeps the walls from closing in." There was a silence then, the old familiar one that had lived between them since Elaine passed. Elaine Pike had been a nurse, gentle but firm, the kind of woman who could quiet a room without raising her voice. When she was gone, Warren stayed in the house they had shared, while Molly asked him to move closer, and he answered with repairs, excuses, and weather reports. "I do not want to lose you to some trouble that is not yours," Molly said. Warren looked at Ranger, whose eyes were open under the table. "Maybe it became mine when the dog stopped the truck." After the call, Warren walked to his workshop behind the house. The yellow lamp glowed over wood shavings, clamps, and the photograph of Elaine he kept above the bench. In it, she wore a blue sweater and smiled like she had just forgiven him for something minor. Ranger settled beneath the table, but his eyes stayed open. For the first time in years, Warren did not only feel the pull of the dead. He felt the living calling him back. Claire Donnelly was not back on duty. Not really. Dr. Sutter had made that clear with the kind of look only doctors and old school teachers knew how to use. Claire could review files, answer questions, and sit upright long enough to pretend she was not tired. She could not chase vans, search warehouses, or stand in the rain with a flashlight and a sidearm. So she worked from a small conference room at the sheriff's office, a blanket over her knees, her brown hair tied back, her face still pale but her eyes sharp enough to cut through excuses. Sheriff Martin Vale had set up a corkboard for her, and on it were photographs of cabinets, delivery receipts, maps of North Hallow, and a printed summary of the New Orleans federal case that had started this uneasy thread. A man from Orleans Parish, a federal charge tied to possession with intent to distribute banned substances, an arrest near the 500 block of Esplanade Avenue, and small packets meant for a crowded tourist district. Claire never claimed the man from that case was running things in Michigan. She only said patterns had footprints, and this one had walked north. Warren Pike stood beside the board with his arms folded, looking less like a detective and more like a carpenter who had been tricked into attending a church committee meeting. His gray beard was neat. His work shirt smelled faintly of cedar dust, and his pale blue eyes kept moving from one cabinet photograph to the next. Ranger sat at his left boot, sable coat shining under the office lights, ears pointed toward the table where 3 evidence bags had been placed. Claire's jacket sleeve, the blue plastic fleck from Old Juniper Road, and the tiny piece Warren had found in his toolbox. Ranger did not touch them. He simply breathed in, slow and thoughtful, then looked up at Warren. "It's the same family of smells," Warren said. "Not the same exact object. Same place, maybe. Pressed wood, cheap adhesive, motor oil, strong cleaner, damp dust from closed storage." Martin Vale, broad-shouldered and tired-eyed, wrote that down. He did not treat Warren like a man wandering into police work. He treated him like what he was, a witness with useful hands and a lifetime of knowing when a cabinet was lying. "You're not searching anything," Martin said. "You're not opening anything. You look at photos. You tell us what looks rebuilt." "That suits me," Warren said. "At my age, kneeling is a legal negotiation." Claire almost smiled. She pointed to one photo. "This one?" Warren leaned closer. "False bottom. See the screw heads? Too clean. And that side panel has no reason to be that thick unless someone wanted it to carry a secret." By noon, the sheriff's office had sent what they had through official channels. Federal agents were interested because the route seemed to cross state lines, and because the markings, FQ route, E500, B file, 0806, looked less like charity records and more like coded shipping notes. Claire stayed careful with every word. Facts mattered. Guessing was how good cases grew weak legs. That afternoon, Warren returned to his workshop and found a young man waiting by the door. He was 22, thin as a fence rail, with sandy hair falling into his eyes, a narrow face, and hands that would have looked soft if not for the fresh scrapes along the knuckles. His jacket was too warm for the weather, and his sneakers were worn nearly flat. "Mr. Pike?" he said. "I'm Eddie Marsh." Warren knew the name. Eddie had delivered furniture for Harbor Hands Relief. Some folks said he had run with the wrong crowd after his father left and his mother got sick. Others said he was lazy. Warren had lived long enough to know those were often the words people used when they did not want to learn the full story. "What do you want, Eddie?" "Work. Honest work." Eddie swallowed. "I can sweep, lift, sand. I don't care. My mom needs medicine, and I need money that doesn't come with somebody looking over my shoulder." Ranger stood beside Warren and studied Eddie with calm brown eyes. Eddie did not step back. He only lowered his hand and let the dog smell his fingers. That earned him half a point in Warren's private accounting of character. "I'm not a charity," Warren said. "No, sir, I'm not asking for charity." Warren looked at the boy's tired face and thought of Molly. Thought of all the young people who made one wrong turn and found the road behind them full of people shaking their heads. "Sweep the shop. Don't touch the saw. Don't lie to me." Eddie nodded. "Yes, sir." A chair leg cracked in the diner that evening with a sound like a small bone of the building giving up, and every head turned at once. Eddie, without being asked, crossed the room, knelt beside Nora Bell's old wooden chair, and held the broken joint gently in both hands as if it were something worth saving. Nora Bell stood over him, red hair tied back, round face suspicious but curious. "You break it?" "No, ma'am." "Can you fix it?" "Yes, ma'am." "With what?" Eddie glanced at Warren, who had stopped in for coffee with Ranger. "If Mr. Pike lets me borrow glue and a clamp." Warren stared at the boy a long moment, then went out to the truck. Eddie fixed the chair in 20 minutes and refused Nora's money. "You feed half the town," he said. "Call it even." Nora looked at Warren after Eddie left. "That boy's either got a good heart or a guilty one. Sometimes those live in the same chest," Warren said. Outside, Ranger nudged Eddie's jacket, The dog's ears lifted. Warren frowned and reached carefully into the inside pocket. He pulled out a sealed envelope thick with cash. Eddie went white. "That's not mine." Warren believed him before he wanted to. The fear on Eddie's face was too raw to be acting. He did not open the envelope. He called Claire, and Martin sent a deputy to collect it properly. If someone had planted money on Eddie, they wanted a scapegoat with a familiar name and a weak reputation. 2 days later, a legal inspection of the Harbor Hands warehouse began. Warren stood back with Ranger while Martin, Claire from a chair near the entrance, and authorized officers handled the search. The warehouse smelled of cardboard, old varnish, and lake damp. Rows of donated furniture sat under fluorescent lights. Ranger walked calmly along the aisle, then sat in front of a small white medicine cabinet. Warren examined it without opening it. "Bottom's too thick. Hinges are newer than the frame. Wrong nails." The officers opened it. Inside were small sealed packets, a coded ledger, route notes, printed photos of Esplanade Avenue, and a folded page marked B-file/FQ route/08-06. Caleb Rusk was nowhere to be found. Martin's face hardened when a call came through. Someone had warned Caleb. The leak pointed toward a deputy's access code. His son's access code. Deputy Aaron Vale. Martin did not shout. He closed his eyes once, then asked another officer to contact internal review and notify the federal team. He would not bury truth to protect blood. That kind of honor looked painful, but it stood straight. As they left, Ranger stopped beside the outside trash bin. He nosed open a torn paper bag and revealed a cheap phone with a cracked screen. One message remained, half deleted. "Move her before the old man talks. Dog saw too much." That night, Warren locked his workshop. Ranger stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the dark pines beyond the yard. Warren rested one hand on the dog's strong back and felt the truth settle cold and clear. Ranger had not only found evidence, the old dog had become a living witness. By the time the sun slipped behind the pines, Blue Loon Marina had begun to glow like a place from an old postcard. Yellow lamps hung over the wooden docks, soft fog drifted across the water, and the moored boats rocked gently as Lake Superior breathed against their sides. Ropes tapped against metal cleats with a hollow little rhythm, steady as a nervous heart. Warren Pike stood near the outer fence with Ranger beside him, both of them watching the lights shimmer on the black-blue water. He was not there to be brave. He had told himself that twice. He was there because he knew cabinets, false bottoms, and the strange ways men hid ugly things inside useful objects. Ranger, with his sable coat dark under the marina lamps and silver around his muzzle, stood alert but calm, as if he understood that old dogs and old soldiers were sometimes asked to witness what younger men had missed. DEA had taken the outer perimeter. Agent Luis Navarro led the federal team, a lean man in his mid-40s with close-cropped black hair, bronze skin, and watchful eyes that rarely blinked. He spoke quietly, the way serious men do when they know loudness wastes time. Sheriff Martin Vale worked beside him, broad shoulders tight beneath his jacket, his face drawn with the pain of a father who had chosen truth over comfort. His son, Deputy Aaron Vale, had confessed earlier that day. Aaron was 29, tall and fair-haired like his mother had been, with a clean face and the frightened look of a boy who had mistaken one small wrong choice for something he could control. At first, he had taken money to pass along patrol schedules he believed were harmless. Later, Caleb Rusk used transfers and messages to keep him silent. It was Aaron's leak that had placed Claire Donnelly on that lonely road. Martin had not protected him. He had handed the matter to internal review and the federal team, then stood in the hallway afterward with one hand against the wall, breathing like a man carrying a stone inside his chest. Warren had seen grief in many uniforms. This one was quiet, and it did not ask to be forgiven quickly. Claire stood near the command vehicle, not fully back on duty, but present by permission. She wore a dark jacket over her shoulder holster and moved carefully, still stiff from the night she had been found in the grass. Her brown hair was tied low, her gray-blue eyes fixed on the marina. She was there to identify Caleb Rusk if he appeared, and to connect his face to the man behind Harbor Hand's relief. She would not lead the arrest. She would not rush the docks. She had promised Dr. Sutter, and perhaps more importantly, she had promised herself that surviving did not mean pretending nothing hurt. Caleb's plan was simple in the way polished lies often were. He wanted to move the last northern shipment before the August 6th date tied to the B-file made other people look harder at related routes. He feared that after the New Orleans sentencing hearing, side records, interviews, or financial scraps might draw attention to the hidden northern line. So he was clearing Blue Loon before dawn, carrying coded ledgers, sealed packets, and the last of the cabinet inserts through a small boat registered to a shell company no one in North Hallow had heard of. Warren's job was to remain outside the main action and identify altered storage pieces if asked. He had repeated that instruction to Ranger, though Ranger had given him the patient look of a dog who understood rules but also understood souls. Then Ranger's ears lifted. He turned away from the water, away from the main dock, toward a low storage shed near the bait freezer. "Ranger," Warren whispered. The dog moved, not running, but with purpose. Warren followed. A local deputy started to stop him, but Agent Navarro saw Ranger's posture and gave one sharp nod. The shed door was unlocked. Inside, under the smell of rope, old fuel, and wet wood, came a thin sound. Not a shout, not a word. A breath breaking apart. From inside the dark shed, a single metal hook swung against the wall, tap, 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 though no wind had entered. Ranger froze, lowered his head, and the night seemed to hold its breath with him. Warren stepped in slowly. In the corner sat Eddie Marsh, knees drawn up, hands trembling, face pale under the yellow bulb. The 22-year-old looked smaller than he had in the diner, all sharp elbows and fear, his sandy hair stuck to his forehead. He had been left there with tape around his wrists and panic in his eyes, framed by Caleb to look like the weak link who could carry blame. Ranger did not rush him. The old dog lay down a few feet away, chin low, brown eyes steady. Eddie stared at Ranger, breathing hard, then slowly stopped shaking. "Boat?" Eddie whispered. "There's a second boat, under the east slip. Caleb said if things went wrong, he'd use the east slip." Claire heard it over the radio. Within seconds, Agent Navarro shifted 2 teams toward the east side, but Ranger had already turned again. This time he went toward the dock, nose low, then stopped at a splintered post where a small lavender handkerchief had caught in the wood. Warren recognized the scent from Maple Bell Diner, from a sewing bag and a trembling laugh. "June," he said. Claire's face changed. "June Merritt?" Ranger led them beneath the dock house, down a short set of damp steps into a storage crawlspace where the lake water slapped softly below the boards. June Merritt sat against a stack of life jackets, wrapped in her own cardigan, weak and frightened, but awake. Her silver curls had fallen loose. Her round glasses were crooked, and both hands clutched a quilted sewing bag to her chest. For a moment, she looked exactly like the harmless old woman everyone thought she was. Then she looked at Claire and said, clear as church bells, "In my sewing box, lift the blue spool, not the red, the blue. There is a second bottom." Claire went still. June took a breath. "I sent you the note." The room seemed to shift around her. June Merritt, the woman people teased for forgetting umbrellas and sugar packets, had once worked as a legal records clerk in Louisiana. She had filed motions, shipping affidavits, sealed notices, and evidence logs for more than 30 years. When Harbor Hands Relief began using codes like B-file, FQ route, 08-06, and route E-500, June knew they were not ordinary donation notes. She had copied receipts one page at a time, hidden part of the evidence in her sewing box, mailed part of it to herself, and placed the rest in a locked drawer at the old church storeroom. She had pretended to forget names because Caleb's men stopped listening when they thought she was harmless. "I do not forget people's names," June said, her voice thin but steady. "I only let them believe I do." Outside, the east slip erupted in motion. Caleb Rusk appeared in the marina lights, his clean jacket pulled tight, his handsome face no longer gentle. He moved toward a small boat, but the dock was already sealed. Federal agents closed from one side, Sheriff Martin's deputies from another. Ranger bounded up the steps and onto the dock, stopping several yards away. He barked once, deep and clear, not attacking, only announcing that the night had seen him. Caleb stopped. Claire stepped into the lamplight. She did not draw her weapon. She did not need to. Agent Navarro handled the arrest. Claire only looked at Caleb and said, "You thought I would vanish beside that road, but I am still here." While officers secured Caleb, Ranger tugged Warren toward a floating marker under the east slip. A waterproof bag had been tied beneath the buoy line. Warren did not touch it. He pointed it out, and the officers retrieved it properly. Inside were route notes, ledgers, coded delivery pages, and records linking Caleb's northern operation to the same kind of tourist district pattern Claire had studied from the New Orleans file. Not proof that the New Orleans defendant controlled North Hallow. Proof that Caleb had learned from the pattern and tried to carry its shadow north. Later, June sat in the back of an ambulance with a blanket over her shoulders, still holding her sewing box as if it were a family Bible. Ranger rested his head on her knee. Red and blue lights rippled across the lake behind them. North Hallow had thought June was a forgetful old woman, but that night, her memory kept the truth from sinking into the cold water. In the weeks after Blue Loon Marina, North Hallow began learning how quietly a town could change. Nothing dramatic announced it. No bells rang, no newspaper trucks raced through the streets. The lake still breathed against its rocky shore. The pine trees still whispered in the same patient voices. Maple Bell Diner still opened at 6 each morning, and Nora Bell still complained that people tracked too much mud onto her clean floor. But something had shifted beneath the ordinary rhythm of the town, as if an unseen hand had repaired a hidden crack inside its foundation. The federal case expanded exactly as it should have. Caleb Rusk faced charges tied to transporting banned materials across state lines, concealing evidence inside donated household furniture, obstructing lawful investigation, and abusing the trust built around a charitable organization. The legal records made something else clear as well. The New Orleans federal case had been the pattern, not the puppet master. The Michigan branch Caleb built had copied a known method, small, hidden shipments designed to move quietly through tourist communities. But no evidence suggested the Louisiana defendant had directed what happened in North Hallow. Claire insisted on that distinction whenever reporters called. Facts, she said, were a form of respect. Sheriff Martin Vale returned to work with a slower step and heavier eyes. His son Aaron had not been spared consequences. The younger man had chosen to cooperate fully, offering records, messages, and details that helped investigators connect Caleb's final roots. He would face both legal penalties and disciplinary judgment. Martin never spoke publicly about his own pain. But Warren had seen him one early morning standing alone outside the sheriff's office, his hand resting on the hood of his patrol car, his shoulders bowed beneath a grief no uniform could protect him from. Some wounds, Warren thought, belonged not to the body, but to a father's memory of who he had hoped his child might become. Eddie Marsh came to the workshop every day. At first he arrived too early, nervous and eager, his sandy hair still damp from hurried showers, his hands always searching for something useful to carry. He was still thin, still uncertain, but something steadier had begun to settle inside him. The courts had offered him a structured recovery program and community labor in exchange for full cooperation. It did not erase his mistakes. It gave him a road back. Warren had offered him something smaller, but perhaps just as important. A broom. Then sandpaper. Then trust. "You're holding the hinge like it insulted your mother," Warren muttered one morning. Eddie blinked. "Is that bad?" "It means you'll strip the screw." Ranger, lying nearby with his paws crossed, lifted one ear but did not otherwise comment. At 5 years old, the German Shepherd had become the quiet center of the workshop. His sable coat gleamed in the autumn light, his muzzle now carrying a touch more silver than before, though his eyes remained sharp and wise. He watched Eddie with the same careful patience he had once used on Warren. The sharp crack of a dropped hammer echoed across the shop floor, and for one suspended breath, Claire froze in the doorway, her coffee trembling in her hand, as if the sound had pulled her backward into another night. She closed her eyes, breathed, opened them again. Then she smiled. "I'm all right," she said before anyone could ask. Claire Donnelly had returned to work slowly. She no longer tried to pretend fear had vanished. Sometimes the sight of a white van still tightened her chest. Sometimes the sudden hiss of tires on wet pavement made her pause. She had stopped apologizing for that. Healing, she was learning, was not the absence of fear. It was choosing to move kindly through it. Every morning, she stopped at Maple Bell Diner before her shift. Nora handed her coffee without asking her order. Claire always brought one extra biscuit wrapped in a napkin. "For Ranger," she would say. "As if I'd forget," Nora replied. June Merritt had become something of a local legend, though she resisted every attempt to be called one. At the town council meeting, Mayor Evelyn Brooks, a tall, elegant woman in her 60s with silver-streaked black hair and the calm voice of someone who had spent years solving other people's arguments, presented June with a small plaque honoring her courage and persistence. June accepted it with visible discomfort. "I only kept papers," she said, clutching her sewing box. Nora laughed from the back row. "June's paperwork is sharper than my pie knife." The room filled with warm laughter. June smiled, but only for a moment. Then she returned to her chair and quietly checked that her blue spool was still hidden exactly where she had left it. 3 weeks after the marina, Molly Pike arrived from Minnesota. Warren saw her car pull into the driveway and felt something tighten in his chest. She stepped out wearing jeans and an oversized yellow sweater, her brown hair tucked into a loose braid, her mother's eyes watching him with that familiar mixture of affection and restraint. "You look older," she said. "You look expensive." She laughed. It was the easiest beginning they had managed in years. She stayed for 4 days. On the second morning, Warren found her in the kitchen with paintbrushes spread across old newspapers. "What are you doing?" "Saving this room." "You're attacking it." "I'm repainting it." The walls, once pale and faded, slowly turned into a soft, buttery yellow. "Too bright," Warren grumbled. It was Mom's favorite. That night, long after Molly had gone to bed, Warren stood alone in the kitchen. The yellow walls glowed under the lamp. For a moment he could almost hear Elaine humming near the stove. He stayed there a long time. He and Molly did not solve every silence between them. Some distances were too old to cross in one visit. But when she left, she hugged him longer than usual. And afterward, they called each other every Sunday. The workshop changed too, though not into anything grand. Warren did not build a charity. He did not make speeches. He simply sanded the old wooden sign that had hung crooked above the door for years and replaced it with a new one. Ranger's bench below it, in smaller letters. Woodwork, repairs, second chances. Eddie became his first apprentice. They repaired cabinet doors, broken chairs, old porch steps. Sometimes veterans from town came by to sit and talk. Sometimes young people came looking for work. sometimes they stayed. One bright afternoon, the town gathered in the small square near the lake for something Nora called a necessary gratitude event. Warren called it an excuse for free pie. Ranger called it lunch. The mayor knelt and fastened a new leather collar around Ranger's neck. A silver tag gleamed in the sun. Ranger Pike, he found what others missed. Ranger sniffed it once, then immediately turned toward Nora, who was approaching with a plate of homemade biscuits. "Finally," Warren muttered. "Proper priorities." As the laughter rose around them, Warren looked across the square. Molly was adjusting yellow curtains in his kitchen window. Claire was crossing the street with coffee in hand. June sat on a bench, sewing box in her lap. Eddie was bent over the workshop's first cabinet repair, carefully aligning a stubborn hinge. The late afternoon sunlight poured over Lake Superior. The wind moved gently through the pine trees, and Warren understood something he had not known when he first drove home from Mrs. Adler's kitchen with a jar of blueberry jam on the passenger seat. Family was not always what remained unbroken from the beginning. Sometimes family was what a faithful old dog gathered back together. At 65, Warren Pike had believed he was only driving home from a cabinet repair. But Ranger had known better. Some roads lead a man back to his house. Others lead him back to his purpose. When Warren first drove down that quiet lake road, he thought he was simply going home after a cabinet repair. But sometimes life hides its greatest turning points inside the smallest ordinary moments. A tired man, an old truck, a faithful dog, and one lonely road became the beginning of a miracle. This story reminds us that no life is too old to find new purpose, no heart is too tired to love again, and no broken road is beyond God's reach. Warren had lost much. Claire had been left behind. June had been underestimated. Eddie had made mistakes. But through courage, honesty, and the loyal heart of a German shepherd named Ranger, each of them found a way back toward the light. Animals are one of God's gentlest gifts to us. They do not judge our age, our failures, or our past. They simply stay. They listen without words. They notice what others miss. They love with a purity that can soften even the hardest heart. When we care for animals, protect them, and treat them with kindness, we are also practicing a deeper kind of humanity. In everyday life, we may not face a mystery like Warren did, but we all meet moments where kindness matters. We can stop for someone who needs help. We can call a loved one we have been missing. We can forgive someone who is trying to change. We can choose honesty when silence would be easier. We can feed a hungry animal, comfort a lonely neighbor, or simply be present for someone who feels forgotten. Maybe miracles do not always arrive with thunder from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a dog's warning, a stranger's kindness, a daughter's phone call, an old woman's memory, or a second chance we never thought we deserved. And maybe God is closer than we think, working through the small acts of love we choose each day. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us about an animal who changed your life, or a moment when you felt guided, protected, or given a second chance. And if you believe stories of faith, kindness, justice, and loyal animals still matter, please subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing them with you. May God bless you and your family. May He bring peace to your home, healing to your heart, and strength for the road ahead. And may we never forget that sometimes the ones who cannot speak are the very ones God uses to lead us back to love.